the past few weeks we've been reading through some of the early part of the Old Testament and thinking about some of the names that we encounter in those stories. We heard the story of Adam, who is made from the Adamah, the dust of the ground, the earth. We heard the story of Isaac. His name tells the story of how his mother Sarah laughed. Isaac means laughter, both before and after Isaac was born. Last week you still heard the story of how Jacob became Israel because he strove or wrestled with God. Israel means to strive with God, El. All of those names, those first ones we've talked about, they get their meaning from the etymology. That is, the word itself tells you what the name means. Adam means Adamah, earth. Isaac means laughter. Israel means wrestles with God. Today we look at the story of Miriam. The etymology. Everybody okay? Mom's there. Everything's okay now. The etymological meaning of Miriam isn't really clear. Miriam could come from an Egyptian word that means beloved. Miriam was born in Egypt. I think in that way she's a Hebrew. She's an Israelite, but she was born in Egypt. She might be like some of you who have immigrated to this country and you give your children Americanized or westernized names. So maybe Miriam is from the Egyptian word for beloved. If we want to look at what it means in Hebrew, it's a little tricky. Hebrew words are all made up mostly of three consonants. So you could look at words that have M and R in them. The Hebrew root marar, it means bitter or strong. It's the word that gives us myrrh, one of the gifts that was presented to Jesus when he was born. Myrrh is used to anoint the body for burial. In the book of Ruth, Naomi says she will change her name to Mara, because the Lord has dealt bitterly with her in the loss of her husband and her sons. So that's one possible meaning for the name Miriam, if it comes from marar. It could also come from Marah. It's kind of similar, Marah. Marah means rebellious or contentious. In a noun form it means rebellion. And there's another Hebrew word, mor, which means to change. So all of these possibilities, strong, bitter, rebellious, contentious, changing. And then that word yam, that's a really easy Hebrew word. It means the sea. So Maryam. Maybe it means something like waters of strength, or sea of rebellion, or sea of change. There's really no definitive meaning if you look at the Hebrew. It's not as clear as Adam or Isaac or Israel. The meaning of the name Miriam ultimately will be determined not by the root of the word, but by the story of the woman who bears that name and who brings it to life. Now the name Miriam doesn't show up in print until Exodus chapter 15. But the character shows up without a name in the very beginning of the Exodus story. We encounter her first simply as the sister of the boy Moses, who is hidden in a basket among the reeds of the Nile to protect him from a ruler who would take his life. And so without ever being mentioned by name, Miriam secretly kept watch over her brother. And when her brother was discovered by Pharaoh's daughter, the girl Miriam spoke up. She intervened with the princess so that her brother Moses could be nursed by their own mother. Perhaps waters of strength is a good meaning for the name of Miriam. Now we don't hear from Miriam again all through the first 14 chapters of Exodus until we get to Exodus 15, the second short reading that I read today. This is after the Israelites have been delivered from Egyptian slavery across the dry bed of the Red Sea. I think the story is familiar to most. The fleeing Israelites come up on the shores of the sea and they don't know how they're going to pass, and Pharaoh's army is coming up behind them. And Moses raises his staff and the Lord parts the sea and the Israelites pass through safely on dry land while the Egyptians become stuck in the mud and finally perish as the waters close in around them. God's people are free. Now we tend to give most credit to Moses, the deliverer of the Israelites. And that credit's not undue. Moses is the one who God encountered in the burning bush, the one who God called to speak to Pharaoh. But it's also clear that Moses did not lead the people alone. He was accompanied by his brother Aaron and his sister Miriam. In that short section of Exodus 15 that we read today, Miriam is called a prophet. She's the first woman in Scripture to be given that title. And the short song of praise that we have in Exodus chapter 15, verse 21, is thought to be one of the oldest pieces of Hebrew poetry or liturgy or song. And it's a song that is composed and directed by Miriam. Sing to the Lord, she says, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. In this portion of the praise song, Miriam doesn't just sing, but she takes an active leadership role. She's a skilled musician. She conducts all of the women of Israel in both singing and tambourine playing. She leads the joyful praise in song and dance and music because of what the Lord has done. God has delivered. And Miriam leads the people to sing God's praise. The prophet Micah remembers Moses, Aaron, and Miriam together as the ones whom God used to deliver Israel. Miriam, along with her brothers, is both a spiritual and a political leader for the people of Israel. There to deliver them from slavery, to accompany them in their wilderness wandering, to lead them in worship and praise. Perhaps those meanings connected to rebellion and change are fitting for Miriam, who led her people in rebelling against slavery and oppression. Miriam, who journeyed with them as they changed from an enslaved people to a free people, freely praising the God who delivered them. Ultimately, it's not those etymological roots that give the meaning to the name Miriam. The name gets its power from the story of the person who holds it. The one who as a young girl acted with courage and shrewdness to protect her brother. The one who as a woman led the people to freedom and then led them in song and dance. It is a name most fitting to pass on to our own daughters. It is the name of the young girl who will be baptized into the family of Christ and the family of Eliot in just a few moments. Miriam Mbaka takes her name from the biblical Miriam. Some of you know already, because it's a story I like to tell, that Isaac and Honorine blessed me with the honor of choosing Miriam's name. Nearly 2 years later, I still find myself astounded by that precious gift. But I did not first choose the name because of Miriam's courage or leadership. I chose it because on the day of her birth, Miriam's mother, Honorine, reminded me of the mother of Moses and his sister. On the morning of November 11th, 2017, Isaac called me to say that Honorine had gone into Lowell General with the beginning of labor pangs. I promised to pray for a good delivery, and I asked Isaac to call me back when the baby had arrived. Birthing often takes a long time, sometimes a very long time. So I went on about my day, not expecting to hear again from Isaac for many hours, maybe not even until the next day. I was shocked when just 2 hours later, Isaac rang me up to say that the baby girl had arrived. Wow. What's her name? I asked. Isn't that the first thing you ask once you know a baby has made it safely into the world? What's her name? Well, I was even more shocked when Isaac asked me to provide the name. I wasn't actually sure if he meant it. But I headed toward the hospital, pondering this new baby's very swift arrival. And the story that came to mind was the story that we just heard from Exodus chapter 1. It was a season of persecution among the Israelites, when the Pharaoh had ordered that Israelite boys should be killed at birth as a means of controlling the enslaved population. Two midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, we shouldn't forget their names either, they refused to participate in Pharaoh's deadly scheme. And when confronted by Pharaoh, they claimed that the Hebrew women were so strong that they gave birth and hid their children before a midwife could even arrive. Their story was an act of defiance against a murderous ruler. God looked at them with favor for their courage, and the Israelites prospered despite Pharaoh's efforts to oppress them. This is the story that I remembered when Isaac called just 2 hours after Honorine's labor pangs had begun. And while the context of persecution was very thankfully absent, Honorine delivered her daughter before the pastor could arrive. She was strong, like the mother of Moses and Aaron and Miriam. Miriam, it seemed, would be a fitting name for her daughter. So Miriam's story, this Miriam's story, tells a little bit about the circumstances under which she was born. She came quickly. But it also tells the story of another Miriam, a Miriam who is strong and courageous in the face of bitter circumstances. A Miriam who was a prophet, a deliverer, a leader. A Miriam whose song of praise for God still echoes through the millennia. And so my prayer is that this Miriam, our Miriam, may be as compassionate as Miriam who watched over her endangered brother. May she be as bold and as clever as Miriam who stepped forward to reunite her brother with his mother. May she, like the biblical Miriam, rebel against the forces of oppression and be a leader among her people for freedom. May she know God's deliverance and mercy in her own life, and may she lead her community in songs of praise and worship. It is a fitting name to pass on to our daughters. And as Miriam is baptized today into this particular community of faith, may we all walk alongside her as brothers and sisters to remind her of her name and of the stories that it holds. That's our call, church, to tell these stories and to remember that they're not just religious tales. They're not just old, dusty stories from that old part of the Bible. They are our stories. It is Miriam's story. These stories tell us who we are, and they challenge us to live into our truest selves, the people that God created us to be. May it be so for Miriam. May it be so for each of you, whatever your name might be, whatever stories it might hold. Might we be the church together as we remind one another of our stories and remember that our names are etched on the palm of God's hand. May it be so. Amen.
Amen.